The morning was thick with fog, as if the world had forgotten to wake up. The worn boots of local farmers crunched over damp straw, spread unevenly across the muddy ground of the livestock yard. Somewhere in the background, an old tractor coughed and sputtered to life. Near the edge of the auction barn, between crates and weathered fencing, a small girl in a pale blue coat stood quietly. Her name was Opal Brixton, and in her tiny hand, she gripped a wrinkled $5 bill, the last thread of certainty in a world that had unraveled far too soon. Since her mother, Bryony Westwin, died in a car accident earlier that year, Opal had lived with her grandfather, Riven Ashford, on the edge of the Coldmere countryside. Riven was a man of silence and splinters, a former woodworker with calloused hands and a heart sealed off by years of grief. Though he rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, every morning he brewed tea and buttered toast for Opal, trying in his own quiet way to hold them both together. Tied to a crooked post at the far end of the auction lot was a wounded German shepherd. His ribs showed through his matted fur, and scars crisscrossed his legs like painful memories. No one knew exactly where he'd come from, but everyone seemed to agree on one thing: he wasn't worth much. $5 for the dog, the auctioneer called out with a tired voice, already scanning for the next item. Laughter rose from a few older men nearby. 5? That mutt's not worth a bag of feed. And then, without a word, Opal stepped forward. She held the bill out with both hands, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on the man behind the podium. The crowd fell silent for a moment, surprised to see a child taking part in something so adult, so harsh. The auctioneer blinked, then gave a small, disbelieving chuckle. "Well now," he said slowly, "looks like we've got ourselves a bidder." He glanced down at her solemn face. "Sold. To the little miss in blue." The dog didn't move as the crowd dispersed, but his eyes followed Opal with slow recognition, as if trying to believe someone had chosen him. She knelt down in front of him and whispered something no one else could hear. And in that fragile moment, a child with nothing and a dog with no one, a bond was formed. It would be weeks before the town of Coldmere understood what had happened that day. Months before the country heard about it. But for Opal and the dog she would name Finn, that was the moment everything began to change. The pickup truck rattled down the gravel road as twilight settled over the Coldmere fields. Riven Ashford kept his eyes on the road ahead, both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Beside him, Opal sat silently, her small hands folded in her lap. In the back of the truck bed, wrapped in an old quilt, lay the dog Finn, his breathing shallow but steady. Every now and then, Riven checked the rearview mirror not to watch for traffic, but to make sure the dog was still there. Back at the farmhouse, the air smelled of pine and old wood. The place had once been full of life, Bryony's laughter in the kitchen, music humming through the floorboards, but now it felt like a house holding its breath. Riven helped Opal carry Finn inside and lay him down by the fireplace. The dog didn't resist, but his eyes never left the girl's face. She kneeled beside him and placed her hand gently on his head. "You're safe now," she whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it true. Riven stood in the doorway, arms crossed, unsure. He hadn't agreed to bring the dog home. Not really. But when Opal had looked up at him at the auction, dirt on her cheeks, those wide, stubborn eyes, he couldn't bring himself to say no. Still, as he watched her now, he felt the old fear creep in. He had already lost so much. Could he really let himself care again? Especially about a dog on the edge of death? That night, Riven lit the fireplace and made soup, watching as Opal fed Finn small spoonfuls of broth. The dog barely moved, but there was something in the way he accepted her touch, like he had known her in another life. Riven didn't say much, just listened to the wind tapping against the window and the slow rhythm of Opal's voice as she told Finn about her mom, about how she used to braid her hair and sing during thunderstorms. Finn didn't blink. He just listened, too. The next morning, Riven made a call he hadn't made in years. Tamsin Crowhist, the town's only vet, answered with her usual gruff tone. "If he's bleeding out, don't bring him in." "I don't do miracles," she warned. But Riven asked anyway. When they arrived, Tamsin took one look at Finn and sighed. "That dog's been through hell," she muttered. "But sometimes hell makes the strongest souls." She patched him up the best she could and told Opal gently, "He may not walk right again. You sure you want this responsibility?" Opal didn't even hesitate. "He needs me," she said. But what no one realized, not yet, was how much she needed him too. In the quiet spaces between pain and healing, something unspoken was beginning to form. A bond that went deeper than rescue. A connection that would ripple out far beyond Coldmere. Far beyond anything Riven or even Opal could imagine. By the end of the week, word had spread through Coldmere like smoke through dry fields. People whispered about the little girl who spent her last $5 on a broken dog. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others in disbelief. Riven Ashford let a mutt like that into his house? Vera Colden murmured to a customer at her store, eyebrows arched. And the girl? She's so young. Doesn't even understand what she's taken on. Riven heard the talk every time he went into town. Sideways glances at the feed store, quiet nods at the gas station. But he said nothing. He wasn't a man who explained himself. What bothered him more was the way some people talked like Opal had made a mistake. As if kindness was some foolish impulse. He'd seen enough of life to know better. But even he couldn't explain why that dog, thin, scarred, barely holding on, had stirred something in his chest that he thought had gone cold years ago. At home, Finn was changing too. Slowly but noticeably. He still limped and slept for most of the day, but when Opal entered the room, his ears perked. He followed her with his eyes, and once, just once, he let out a soft thump of his tail against the floor when she giggled at something in a book. Riven watched from the hallway. He didn't say a word, but the smallest smile crept across his face before he turned away. Opal began reading to Finn every afternoon, her voice small and soothing. She brought him water in an old metal bowl and tucked him in with blankets from her own bed. Each time he shivered in his sleep, she placed a hand on his side and whispered, "It's okay now. You're home." These weren't words she had learned. They were things she needed to hear herself. Maybe that's why they mattered so much. One afternoon, as Riven chopped firewood behind the barn, a dusty sedan pulled into the driveway. Out stepped Noah Vexley, a young journalist from the Coldmere Gazette. She was curious, soft-spoken, and held a camera that looked far too expensive for such a small-town paper. "I heard a story about a girl and a dog," she said, almost apologetically. "I'd like to know if it's true." Riven looked her over carefully, then motioned toward the house. "You'll have to ask her yourself." Inside, Opal sat on the floor beside Finn, reading aloud from an old book of fairy tales. She looked up at Noah, not frightened, just curious. "Are you here to take him away?" she asked. Noah knelt down, lowered her camera, and smiled. "No, sweetheart. I think I'm here to tell people why you saved him." And in that moment, Opal realized that maybe her story, their story, was only just beginning to be heard. The article ran 2 days later under the headline, "Girl gives last $5 to save dying dog and teaches a town what love means." The photo showed Opal kneeling beside Finn, her hand resting gently on his paw, eyes steady and full of something far older than her years. Within hours of its publication online, the story began to spread. Comments flooded in, messages from strangers, donations. Some people cried, others remembered their own lost pets. The phone in Riven's kitchen rang 3 times that day, all reporters. Riven had no interest in the attention. He hated the idea of cameras and questions invading their quiet lives. But Noah Vexley had kept her word. The article wasn't about pity. It was about Opal's courage and Finn's fight to live. Still, the sudden attention made something inside Riven ache. It wasn't just the past catching up with him. It was the fear that someone, somewhere, would take this moment from Opal, from Finn, from him. He didn't trust the world to let good things last. Meanwhile, Finn had begun to walk short distances across the house. His gait was uneven, and his back legs still dragged slightly, but he followed Opal room to room like a shadow stitched to her heels. Tamsin Crowhurst had returned once to check his healing. "You've got a stubborn one," she told Opal. "The kind that doesn't give up, even when it hurts." Opal smiled at that, and whispered to Finn later that night, "You're like me." At school, Mira Thistle, Opal's teacher, had gently brought up the article. She asked the class what kindness meant. A few children teased Opal, not cruelly, but with the shallow curiosity of kids who didn't understand loss. Opal didn't speak much in return, but she drew a picture of Finn with a crown on his head and gave it to Mira. On the back, she wrote in crooked handwriting, "He wasn't broken, he was just waiting." That night, Riven sat alone on the porch, the sky above him dark and full of stars he couldn't name. He held a worn letter in his hands, one he'd read dozens of times, from Bryony, written just before she died. In it, she'd said, "Dad, if anything happens, don't let her grow up afraid. Let her find something to hold on to, even if it's small, even if it's a dog." Riven blinked hard, the words pressing into him like a stone against his ribs. He hadn't known how to give Opal that kind of hope. Until now. Back inside, Opal lay asleep on the floor beside Finn, her fingers gently curled around his collar. The fireplace cast long, flickering shadows on the wall. Riven watched them from the doorway, not moving, not speaking. Just standing there, a man slowly beginning to understand that redemption sometimes walks in on four legs and speaks no words at all. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of gray day that felt hollow even before anything went wrong. Riven was fixing the fence out back when he saw the car pull up. Not local, black, clean, and out of place among the dust and rust of Coldmere. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a stiff suit and polished shoes. He walked like he didn't have time to waste, and Riven's gut tightened instantly. Something about him didn't belong. Opal was inside, curled up with Finn on the worn living room rug, reading aloud from a book about wolves. When the knock came, Finn's ears twitched, and his body stiffened. He let out a low growl, not loud, but sharp, protective. Riven opened the door and blocked the man's view inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The man extended a business card. "Evander Locke. I represent the Midwestern Canine Recovery Bureau. That German Shepherd, Finn. He matches the description of a dog reported stolen over a year ago from an illegal fighting ring in Missouri." Riven's stomach dropped. He didn't answer. The man continued, calm but firm. "We've been tracking survivors of that operation. That dog is valuable to our investigation. If confirmed, he may be removed for federal evaluation. There are legal procedures in place." Riven stepped outside, pulling the door nearly shut behind him. "He belongs to my granddaughter now," he said. Evander's eyes narrowed. "That may not be up to you." Inside, Opal sat frozen, listening. She couldn't hear every word, but she knew something was wrong. Finn pressed closer to her side, his eyes never leaving the door. She held onto his collar tightly, her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. He had just started walking beside her again, just started sleeping without flinching. The idea of losing him, of having him taken by strangers, made something fierce rise in her chest. Later that night, Riven explained what had happened, choosing his words carefully. "They think Finn belonged to bad people, and they might want to take him." Opal didn't speak for a long time. Then she said very softly, "But he doesn't belong to them anymore. He chose me." Riven didn't know what to say to that, because deep down he agreed. The next morning, Opal placed her drawing of Finn, the one with the crown, in the front window facing the road. A message to anyone who might come looking. He is loved here. He is not leaving. Riven made a call to Ansel Darrow, the town sheriff, to ask what legal options they had. Meanwhile, Noah Vexley, having caught wind of the government interest, began preparing a second article, one that would ask the world a simple question. Can a heartbroken child and a damaged dog ever truly be separated again? The next few days moved slowly, like walking through deep snow. Opal barely let Finn out of her sight. Even when he limped to the water bowl or shifted to lie by the fireplace, she followed, quiet, alert, as if the world might try to steal him away when she blinked. Riven noticed. He also noticed how Finn had changed. The dog who once flinched at every sound now stood guard at the door, his gaze steady and calm. Whatever wounds remained on the outside, something deeper was healing. Riven drove into town early Friday morning to speak with Sheriff Ansel Darrow, a longtime friend and one of the few people Riven trusted. Ansel listened carefully as Riven explained the visit from Evander Locke. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, chewing on the end of a pencil. "If that dog really is evidence in a federal case," he said slowly, "there's only so much we can do." Riven's jaw tightened. "They want to take him from her. After everything." Ansel looked down at the desk, then met Riven's eyes. "What's right and what's legal, they're not always the same thing." Back at the farmhouse, Noah Vexley returned with her camera. This time, she brought a sound recorder and a larger notebook. She had one goal now: to tell the full story. "People need to see who Finn is now," she told Riven. "Not what he used to be." Opal agreed to speak, sitting next to Finn on the porch while Noah recorded. "He's not just a dog," Opal said softly. "He's my person." When Noah asked what she would do if they took him away, Opal didn't cry. She just said, "They'd have to take me too." Later that evening, Vera Colden knocked on the door with a fresh loaf of bread and a folded letter. "Some of us in town, we've been talking," she said. "We think what you're doing matters. If they try to come back, they won't face just you." Riven accepted the bread, but it was the letter that caught his attention. It was a petition. Signatures from shop owners, neighbors, teachers, even kids from Opal's school, asking the authorities to let Finn stay. A community's quiet rebellion, written in ink. As night fell, Riven sat with Opal on the front steps. The porch light buzzed softly. Finn lay at their feet, head resting on Opal's knee. Riven looked out across the fields and spoke without looking at her. "I wasn't ready to raise you. I didn't think I could." Opal didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "It's okay. I think we're learning together." Riven nodded, the weight in his chest loosening just a little. But miles away, Evander Locke wasn't finished. In a quiet office under fluorescent lights, he stared at a printed version of Noah's article, lips pressed in a hard line. He picked up the phone. "Prepare the request," he said. "We're not leaving that dog there." And with that, the battle lines were quietly drawn. The envelope came on a Monday, thin, official, and stamped with the seal of a federal agency. Riven found it tucked into the mailbox just after sunrise, beneath a circular from the feed store and a water bill. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, a formal request for the temporary seizure of property. Namely, a German Shepherd believed to be evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. The deadline was set, 7 days. He didn't tell Opal right away. How do you explain to a child that the government sees her best friend as a piece of evidence? That kindness has to be negotiated? Riven sat in the kitchen staring at the letter until the coffee went cold. Finn rested nearby, his breathing even, his eyes closing in trust. And Opal, still in her pajamas, was brushing his fur with slow, gentle strokes, as if trying to memorize the feel of him. When Riven finally told her that afternoon, he spoke carefully, simply. Opal listened, quiet at first, but her expression shifted from confusion to something harder. Not anger, not panic, but steel. "They don't get to take him," she said. "He's not theirs anymore." Riven nodded, but he also knew the weight of systems. He'd fought with bureaucracies before, and they rarely lost. Still, something about Opal's calmness, her certainty, gave him pause. That night, Riven called Tamsin Crowhist, who arrived with a manila folder of veterinary reports and her own brand of stubborn resolve. "This dog is trauma-bonded," she said. "If they remove him now, they could set his healing back months, maybe longer. They need to understand that." Noah Vexley showed up an hour later with a legal contact from out of town and her second article drafted, this time titled, "When Healing Becomes a Legal Battle." Meanwhile, something was happening in Coldmere. At school, Mira Thistle had the students write essays on what makes a family. At Vera Colden's shop, donations were collected in a jar labeled, "For Finn and Opal's Fight." Even Dorian Elmbrook, The reclusive farmer who hadn't spoken to Riven in 5 years came by to offer help. "I don't know much about law," he said, "but I know what right looks like, and this is right." But for every voice raised in support, there was a clock ticking. Riven sat on the porch alone late into the night, the paper still in his hand, the ink smudged at the edges. "I couldn't protect Bryony," he whispered into the dark, "but maybe I can do this." Inside, Opal lay curled next to Finn, her hand on his chest, counting each beat like a promise. Somewhere beyond the hills, a black car drove through the fog, headlights cutting through the night. The deadline was coming, and with it, a decision that could either shatter what they'd built or show the world what love was truly worth. It was the 7th day. The sun hadn't fully risen, and already the air felt different, heavier, like the sky was holding its breath. Riven stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the gravel road. He'd been up all night, pacing. The paperwork had been reviewed, the letters sent, the signatures gathered. But deep down, he knew that none of it guaranteed anything. Evander Locke was coming, and this time not to talk. Opal was dressed before dawn, her little backpack zipped and ready. Not with toys or snacks, but with what mattered. A drawing of Finn, a photo of her mother, and the small silver chain Bryony used to wear. She sat on the porch beside Finn, her fingers buried in his fur. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just waited, her small body planted like a stone in the path of a coming storm. The black sedan appeared just before 8 a.m., accompanied by a government van. 2 men stepped out with Evander, one holding a clipboard, the other a transport crate. Riven moved to the porch steps, arms crossed, his eyes hard. "We're not handing him over," he said. "You'll need a court order." Evander's voice was cold. "We have one, signed at dawn. We've followed every protocol." He gestured toward Finn. "This dog is part of an ongoing investigation." Before Riven could answer, Opal stood. Slowly, calmly, she stepped between Finn and the men. "He's not part of anything anymore," she said, her voice steady. "He's part of me." The older man with the crate hesitated. The moment stretched in silence, broken only by the sound of distant birds and the slow creak of the front gate. Then a car pulled up, and another, and another. One by one, neighbors began arriving. Tamsin Crowhurst stood beside her truck, holding Finn's medical file high. "This animal is under treatment. Removal poses a serious health risk." Vera Colden walked forward with the petition. 117 signatures, she said. "All from Coldmere." Noah Vexley lifted her camera. "Just so we're clear," she said to Evander, "I'm filming every second of this." And from the back, Sheriff Ansel Darrow emerged from his cruiser. "There's no violence happening here today," he said, calmly but firmly. "And no child leaves this porch in tears." Evander stared at the crowd, his mouth tight. This wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a wall of people standing for something that couldn't be measured in documents or legal codes. After a long silence, he turned to the men beside him and muttered, "We're done here for now." They turned back toward the van, the crate untouched. As the vehicles disappeared down the road, Opal sank to her knees beside Finn, wrapping her arms around him. Riven let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't over, not yet, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn, not in law, but in love, and the whole town had chosen which side to stand on. The morning after the standoff was quiet. Not the tense kind of quiet that came before a fight, but the kind that comes after something sacred has been protected. The gravel road was empty. The porch steps were damp with dew. Inside the farmhouse, a single shaft of sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, casting warm light on the table where a new letter now rested. Not a threat, but an apology. It came from Evander Locke's office, unsigned, but clear in its tone. In light of recent public concern and ongoing medical recovery, the agency has decided not to pursue further action at this time. Riven read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and placed it next to Bryony's old photograph. He didn't smile, but there was a new kind of peace in the way he exhaled, the kind that came from finally not losing something you love. Opal didn't ask about the letter. She didn't need to. She already knew. Instead, she spent the day with Finn in the backyard, tossing soft tennis balls and laughing when he chased them. Awkwardly, clumsily, with a limp in his back leg, but with more life in him than ever before. He even barked once, surprising them both. It was rough and broken, but it was his voice, and Opal clapped her hands like he just performed magic. That evening, the townspeople gathered near the old grain silo for what Vera Colden called a victory supper. Tables were set up with homemade pies, casseroles, and warm cornbread. Someone brought a guitar, and children ran barefoot through the grass while fireflies lit the edges of the night. Riven stood by the edge of the crowd, watching Opal dance in a circle of kids, Finn limping happily behind her. No one treated him like a broken animal anymore. He was just hers, a piece of her story. As the music slowed and stars blinked awake in the sky, Dorian Elmbrook approached Riven with a flask and a rare smile. "You know," he said, "I used to think we were all just surviving out here, but that little girl, she's living. And somehow, she's dragging the rest of us with her." Riven nodded slowly, his gaze still on Opal. "She didn't drag me," he said softly. "She gave me a reason to move." Later that night, back at home, Opal curled up beside Finn in the living room, a blanket draped over them both. Riven watched from the hallway, then walked over and sat beside them. He placed a hand on Finn's head and the other gently on Opal's shoulder. No words were spoken. None were needed. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, not with warning this time, but with something softer. Promise that tomorrow they would begin again, not as survivors of loss, but as a family reborn through love. Spring arrived slowly in Coldmere, like an old friend hesitant to come inside. The snow melted into soft mud, then into green shoots pushing through the earth. On the Ashford farm, wildflowers began to bloom in the edges of the pasture, and birds returned to the bare trees with songs that hadn't been heard in months. Life was changing, gently but undeniably. Riven built a new gate at the back of the property, not because it was needed, but because he wanted to. His hands, once stiff from silence and grief, moved with purpose again. He had even begun carving small wooden animals, something he used to do for Bryony when she was a girl. Now he carved them for Opal. She kept them lined up by the window, next to Finn's bowl and a little rock she'd painted with the words, "Forever Friends." Finn was stronger now. His limp remained, but it no longer defined him. He had become a familiar sight in town, walking beside Opal as she delivered eggs with Riven or visited Vera's shop. Kids from school no longer whispered about him. They knelt to pet him. Some even brought him treats. And when people asked about him, Opal would say simply, "He found me when I needed to be found." No one ever questioned it. The second article by Noah Vexley had gone national. Letters came in from veterans, teachers, shelter workers, all touched by the story of a girl who refused to give up on a dog that the world had given up on. Some asked if they could visit. Others sent collars, toys, or hand-sewn blankets. But the gift that meant most arrived in a plain envelope, an official notice that Finn had been formally released from the investigation. He was at last legally Opal's. One night, as twilight settled over the hills, Riven took Opal and Finn up to the top of the pasture where Bryony used to sit. They watched the sun dip below the horizon in silence. Then Riven reached into his coat and handed Opal a small wooden carving, a girl holding a dog in her arms. On the base, he had carved just one word, belonging. Opal held it close, her eyes wide. "Did Mom ever come up here?" she asked. Riven nodded, his voice low. "All the time. She said it made the world feel quiet enough to listen." As the stars blinked awake above them, Opal lay back in the grass, Finn beside her, his head resting on her chest. Riven sat nearby, knees pulled up, gazing out over the land. For the first time in a long while, the silence wasn't heavy. It was sacred. And in that stillness, it became clear. This wasn't just the end of a hard chapter. It was the beginning of something whole. A new life, a new family. place called home.